Thank you for being here. Today we're going to explore something many people sense but rarely articulate: the deep similarities between organized religion and cult psychology, not in a way that mocks or dismisses, but in a way that looks at the patterns, the mechanisms, the social structures that make people follow with absolute loyalty. Because once you start noticing these patterns, you realize something powerful. The difference between what people call a cult and what they call a religion is often just size, time, and cultural acceptance. The underlying methods are strikingly the same. When you think about a cult, what comes to mind? A charismatic leader, absolute loyalty, strict rules, social isolation, and the sense that outsiders are dangerous. Now compare that to the behavior of large, organized religions. The names are different, the scale is bigger, the architecture grander, but the techniques are familiar. Start with the foundation: control over truth. In every major religion, there is a claim of exclusive access to ultimate reality. This isn't presented as an opinion, it's presented as fact, often as the only fact that matters. And questioning that fact isn't seen as intellectual curiosity, it's seen as rebellion or sin. That's the first marker of a cult mentality. Truth isn't discovered, it's delivered. And once delivered, it cannot be challenged without consequences. Another feature is the demand for absolute loyalty. In cults, this often revolves around a single living leader. In organized religion, the leader might be a figure from the past, but their words are guarded by a hierarchy: priests, pastors, imams, who claim to interpret the will of that figure. The result is the same: an authority structure that demands obedience over inquiry. When someone steps outside those lines, punishment follows. Not always physical, but so they might be shunned, excluded, or branded as dangerous. This isn't accidental. It's how the system preserves itself. By making belonging conditional on belief, it ensures that leaving carries a heavy cost. Psychologists call this high-cost exit. The harder it is to leave, the more people stay, even when doubts grow. That's why many religions tie identity to belief so tightly. It's not just a set of ideas, it's your family, your community, your entire social world. Walk away, and you risk losing everything. Cults do the same thing on a smaller scale. They isolate you so completely that the outside world feels threatening, and that's what large religions often achieve through social norms, even without physical walls. When everyone around you shares the same belief, leaving feels like self-exile. That's not a coincidence, that's social control. Then there's the language of fear. Cults thrive on fear because fear suppresses doubt. Organized religion has perfected this tool over centuries. Eternal punishment, divine wrath, cosmic judgment. These ideas create a psychological cage. Even when evidence for these threats is non-existent, the fear feels real because it's implanted early, often in childhood, and childhood is the most fertile ground for belief. Studies in developmental psychology show that ideas learned before critical thinking skills develop sink the deepest. That's why most people follow the religion they were born into, not because they investigated all options and chose the best one, but because early conditioning works. And that's exactly how cults operate. They create a closed system where questioning feels dangerous, where loyalty feels like survival. Another shared tactic is emotional reward. Fear is the stick, but hope is the carrot. Cults promise enlightenment, special knowledge, salvation from a world of chaos. Religions promise heaven, liberation, ultimate peace. Both tap into the human longing for certainty in an uncertain world. That longing is powerful because life is unpredictable, fragile, full of suffering. When someone says, "We have the answer and all you need to do is obey," it feels comforting, even if the claim has no proof. This isn't stupidity, it's psychology. The brain craves patterns and security. Systems that offer those things, no matter how irrational, are deeply seductive. And the larger the system, the more it normalizes this seduction. Cults also use rituals to create cohesion. So do religions, but on a grander scale. Weekly services, prayers, fasting, confessions, all serve the same purpose, reinforcing identity and loyalty through repetition. Neuroscience confirms that repeated behaviors paired with emotional intensity strengthen neural pathways. Over time, the ritual feels essential and skipping it feels wrong, even when the original reasons are forgotten. That's why traditions endure. They're not just ideas, they're embodied habits. And habits are harder to break than beliefs. This is why leaving a religion feels like ripping out a part of yourself. It's not just intellectual, it's physical, social, and emotional. There's also the tactic of us versus them thinking. Every cult draws a line between the enlightened inside and the deceived outside. Religions do the same. Believers are the chosen, the saved, the righteous. Non-believers are lost, blind, even evil. This division fuels loyalty because it creates a sense of specialness. You're not just someone, you're part of the truth holders in a world of error. That feels empowering, but it also breeds fear and hostility toward those who think differently. And that's why interfaith conflict isn't an accident. It's a byproduct of systems that frame identity as exclusive. When your truth requires everyone else to be wrong, cooperation becomes fragile and violence becomes possible. History is proof of that. Now, some will argue that calling religion cult-like is unfair because religions build hospitals, schools, charities. That's true, but doing good doesn't erase control mechanisms. Many cults also perform acts of kindness for insiders. The question isn't whether good exists in the system, it's whether the system relies on psychological manipulation to maintain power. And when you look closely, it does. The structure depends on early indoctrination, emotional leverage, and social penalties for dissent. It depends on shaping thought, not by presenting evidence, but by framing obedience as virtue and doubt as sin. That's not open inquiry, that's control. As we continue, we'll explore why people embrace these systems, even when the costs are high, and why walking away is so rare. Because understanding that isn't just about criticizing religion, it's about understanding the human mind, the deep need for belonging, and the ways that need can be used to control us. Fear and hope are two of the oldest tools in the human playbook, and organized religion uses both with extraordinary precision. If you strip away the layers of tradition, art, and ritual, you'll find this dual mechanism at the heart of almost every faith, a terrifying threat paired with an irresistible promise. This combination creates what psychologists call a high-arousal belief system. It binds people not through reasoned agreement, but through emotional extremes. On one hand, there's the dread of eternal punishment, a concept so overwhelming that it eclipses ordinary fears. On the other hand, there's the dream of paradise, reunion with loved ones, endless peace. Together, these two forces trap the mind between desperation and desire. That's why fear alone doesn't work forever. It exhausts people. And hope alone doesn't command obedience. It feels optional. But fear and hope together? That's a psychological vice that holds for life. What's remarkable is how early this conditioning begins. Most people don't choose their religion after weighing evidence. They inherit it as children when the brain is most impressionable. Developmental research shows that between ages 3 and 7, the brain is in what neuroscientists call a hyper-absorptive state. It's wired to accept authority without skepticism because, at that age, questioning adults could be dangerous for survival. Religions exploit this window. Stories of divine love and divine wrath are introduced before the child can separate metaphor from reality. By the time critical thinking develops, the emotional associations are already locked in. That's why doubt feels like danger later in life. It's not just a thought, it's a violation of the mental framework that once kept you safe. This is the same mechanism cults use during intense initiation periods, flooding recruits with fear, then offering relief through loyalty. Now let's talk about group dynamics. Psychologists studying high-control groups find a consistent pattern: isolation, repetition, and identity fusion. Isolation doesn't always mean physical walls. It can mean social bubbles, when nearly everyone you know shares your faith, when your holidays, friendships, and even job networks revolve around it. You live inside a soft barrier. Outsiders become abstract, not real. And that's enough to reinforce loyalty. Repetition is the next layer. Weekly services, daily prayers, annual rituals all drill the same messages into the subconscious. Each time you repeat a creed or a verse, you strengthen the mental link between belief and belonging. Over time, you don't just hold the belief, you embody it. That's identity fusion, when your sense of self merges with the group. At that point, leaving isn't just changing your mind, it's dismantling your identity. That's why people describe deconversion as terrifying. It feels like death. And systems that make leaving feel like dying? That's cult psychology on a grand scale. Here's something many overlook. Even the language of religion reinforces this grip. Words like lost, fallen, saved, chosen. They frame reality as a moral battlefield where only insiders are safe. This creates a cognitive bias called the in-group/out-group effect. Studies show that when people divide the world into us and them, empathy drops for outsiders. This isn't unique to religion. It happens in politics, sports, nationalism, but religion amplifies it with cosmic stakes. If your group holds the only path to eternal life, everyone else isn't just different, they're doomed. And if they're doomed, compassion feels less urgent. That's how good people justify harm in the name of faith. It's not malice, it's moral reasoning inside a closed system. History provides endless proof. Look at the medieval church enforcing orthodoxy through torture, not because leaders were sadistic, but because they believed saving a soul justified any pain. Look at theocratic states today where apostasy is punishable by death, not because individuals are inherently cruel, but because the system defines dissent as treason against the ultimate order. When loyalty is tied to salvation, any act feels righteous. Cults use this logic too, but on a smaller scale. A leader convinces followers that disobedience endangers their soul or their destiny, and suddenly betrayal feels worse than violence. The pattern is the same: fear, identity, and exclusivity overriding empathy and reason. What's fascinating is how these systems adapt. When outright coercion becomes socially unacceptable, religions lean harder on psychological tactics. Instead of burning heretics, they warn of eternal separation. Instead of physical exile, they threaten spiritual abandonment. The pain is less visible, but it's still real. Ask anyone who's been cut off from their family for questioning faith. That wound is deep because it strikes at the human need for belonging, a need wired into our species for survival. This is why people cling to belief, even when evidence collapses. It's not ignorance, it's the terror of loneliness. Cults understand this. So do religions. They just scale it. As we move forward, we'll explore why these mechanisms persist even in an age of science, and what happens when entire generations start breaking free from them. Because make no mistake, that's happening now. And the reaction from institutions that once held absolute power is revealing everything about how fragile that power really was. If cult-like systems thrive on control of information, what happens when that control disappears? This is the defining question of our era. For most of human history, religious institutions owned the narrative. They decided which texts were sacred, who could read them, how they were interpreted. In many traditions, ordinary believers weren't even allowed to access the core scriptures without a mediator. Knowledge was power, and power was sacred. Then the printing press broke that monopoly. Suddenly, ideas could spread without permission. Centuries later, the internet finished the job. Today, any person with a smartphone can access scholarly critiques, historical analysis, and global perspectives in seconds. That's a revolution bigger than the Reformation. Technology doesn't just give access to information, it gives access to community. For someone questioning their faith in the past, isolation was crushing. You could lose family, friends, and your entire social world. That fear kept people silent. Now, online spaces connect doubters across continents. They share stories, support each other, and dismantle the illusion that leaving faith means living alone. This is devastating to systems built on fear. When the threat of isolation vanishes, control weakens. That's why religious authorities warn against dangerous websites, podcasts, and forums. They know that exposure to unfiltered information can undo years of conditioning. It's the same reason cults forbid contact with outsiders, because outside voices break the spell. Education adds another layer. Critical thinking is the natural enemy of dogma because it trains the mind to demand evidence and question authority. Studies show a strong correlation between higher education and lower religiosity. This isn't because universities teach atheism. They don't. It's because they teach methods of inquiry that don't stop at sacred boundaries. When you learn to analyze arguments, weigh obedience, and detect logical fallacies, blind obedience loses its appeal. And when people discover that morality, purpose, and meaning can exist without religious scaffolding, the psychological grip loosens even further. That's why some faith traditions attack science education or demand special treatment for their beliefs. They frame this as protecting truth, but it's about protecting control. This loss of control produces backlash. When influence declines, institutions often respond with panic. We see it in rising fundamentalism, movements that double down on literalism and rigid rules. We see it in political alliances where religious groups seek power through law when persuasion fails. We see it in moral panics about godlessness, framed as a threat to civilization itself. These reactions aren't signs of strength. They're signs of fear. Systems that feel secure don't need coercion. They don't need censorship. They don't need to legislate loyalty. When a religion campaigns to criminalize criticism or to limit education, it's admitting something profound. It can no longer win hearts without force. And when a belief requires force to survive, it has already lost the argument. But let's be clear, leaving isn't easy. Even now, the psychological residue of cult-like systems runs deep. People who walk away often describe feelings of guilt, anxiety, even panic, long after they've stopped believing. That's because fear-based narratives are sticky. They're tied to the survival circuits in the brain. Threats of eternal punishment bypass rational analysis and lodge in the limbic system. So even when someone intellectually rejects those ideas, the emotional echo remains. This is why deconversion can feel like trauma recovery. And recovery takes time. But here's the hopeful part. More people are making that journey than ever before. They're discovering that life without dogma isn't empty. It's open. It's not chaos. It's freedom. And that realization is contagious because authenticity is magnetic. When people see others living fully without fear, they start asking, "Why not me?" This is the cultural shift of our time. Authority without evidence is collapsing. And as it collapses, the tactics that once worked, indoctrination, isolation, fear, become visible for what they always were. People aren't just leaving because they reject beliefs. They are leaving because they see the machinery behind those beliefs. And once you see the machinery, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow that what felt sacred was, in many ways, a system designed to control behavior, maintain hierarchy, and enforce loyalty. That doesn't mean everyone who participates is malicious. Most are sincere. But sincerity doesn't make a system healthy. And the healthiest systems are the ones that can survive questions. Organized religion, like a cult, struggles to do that Because questions expose the truth. The foundation isn't evidence, it's authority. We'll explore real historical examples where organized religion functioned with the same psychological patterns as cults, and how those patterns fueled wars, witch hunts, and systemic abuse. These aren't just stories from the distant past. They're case studies in how belief systems, when fused with power, can turn devotion into domination. History is full of evidence that organized religion has used the same psychological levers as cults, scaled up to control entire nations. Take the medieval church during the Inquisition. The structure wasn't designed to discover truth, it was designed to preserve authority. Dissenters weren't debated, they were silenced through fear. Threats of torture and execution weren't just about punishment, they were about sending a message. Leaving the system is fatal. This is classic high-control behavior. Cult leaders do it on a small stage. Religious empires did it on a global one, and the justification was always the same: saving souls. That framing allowed atrocities to feel righteous. When the stakes are eternal, anything becomes permissible. Look at the Salem witch trials. A society primed with fear turned suspicion into moral duty. People believed the invisible world governed the visible one. That belief wasn't harmless. It fueled paranoia, neighbor against neighbor, and ended in executions. Strip away the context, and the mechanics match modern cult scenarios. A closed system, a charismatic authority, a narrative of cosmic warfare, and absolute certainty that obedience equals virtue. Fast forward to the present, and you see similar logic in groups that enforce rigid codes of purity or justify violence for divine approval. Scale and branding change, but the psychology doesn't. Even in nonviolent forms, the pattern persists. Religious hierarchies maintain power by claiming unique access to truth. They discourage questioning by framing it as sin or weakness. They use guilt to enforce conformity and shame to isolate dissenters. These aren't accidents, they're strategies, refined over centuries because they work. They work because they exploit universal human needs: belonging, certainty, purpose. None of those needs are bad, they're deeply human. But when systems exploit them for control, the cost is freedom. Freedom to think, to doubt, to define meaning without fear. That's why this conversation matters. It's not about demonizing individuals who believe. It's about recognizing structures that prioritize obedience over autonomy. And yet these systems endure. Why? Because they offer something the human psyche craves: simplicity. The world is complex, uncertain, often chaotic. Organized religion promises clarity, order, and ultimate justice. Those promises are powerful when life feels fragile. That's why even in highly educated societies, pockets of fundamentalism thrive. Certainty is addictive. It shields people from the discomfort of ambiguity. But here's the paradox. Real growth comes from embracing ambiguity, not fleeing it. That's the lesson history keeps teaching us, and the one fear-based systems keep hiding. So what happens now? We're living through a shift unprecedented in scale. For the first time, billions have access to alternative worldviews. The monopoly on meaning is broken, and when the old tactics fail, fear, isolation, blind loyalty, what's left? Persuasion by evidence or silence. That's why many religious institutions are shrinking. Not because people hate meaning, but because they want meaning that survives questions. They want communities that don't demand conformity. They want ethics grounded in empathy, not fear of punishment. And that trend isn't slowing, it's accelerating. Does that mean cult-like systems will vanish? Probably not completely. As long as humans crave certainty, someone will sell it. But the spell is breaking. Every person who steps out and says, "I can live without fear, I can choose my values, I can build purpose without submission," makes the spell weaker. And the more visible those lives become, the less power these systems hold. That's the ultimate irony. What organized religion framed as dangerous, doubt, is what liberates the mind. Doubt isn't the enemy of meaning. It's the beginning of honesty, and honesty once tasted is hard to surrender. Thank you for staying with this exploration. If you've made it to the end, it means you value conversations that dig deeper than surface narratives. Share your thoughts below. Do you think organized religion can reform without losing its power? Or is its decline inevitable in an age of transparency? Your perspective matters because this shift isn't just happening in books or headlines. It's happening in the choices each of us makes about what to believe and why.